Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1305. Our subject for this week is going to be the Atlantic world to 1590. And naturally, as you can imagine, this is a rather big subject. We're going to be looking at what's happening in the Atlantic Basin on three sides, basically looking at the Americas, Africa, and Europe, and all the different factors that are tying into the foundations of colonial America. And we're also going to be sort of taking a look at the attitudes and understandings of life and cosmologies of these different groups that are contributing. So, to get things started, I try to keep these videos, a little bit shorter than an average lecture. So, we're going to move kind of fast, but we got to go all the way back to start addressing this topic of the Atlantic world to 1590. Well, that date is rather arbitrary. And what we tend to see is that the idea of this being 1590, some major shifting point, that is only if you're looking at it from a European standpoint or point of view. We know that there were people here in the Americas, millions of people here in the Americas prior to Europe's age of discovery, as they call it. And those people are Native Americans. So, when we look at the Earth, we can go way, way back in time, and at one point, you go back to Pangea, and there's one massive supercontinent. Eventually, this all breaks apart. It becomes the continents that we're familiar with today: Europe, Asia, Africa, basically Oceania, and then North and South America. So, our biggest concern here when we're going that far back in history is the ice ages. And with all of this sort of global movement, the shifting of continents, the breaking up of plates, we're seeing a lot of climatic changes that impact human history. And with these ice ages, they happen just about every 100,000 years in Earth's history, and they can last for as long as 10,000 years. Sometimes they can be 20,000 years. So, what's kind of important to understand about these ice ages is basically ice creeps from the poles in the north and the south. And a lot of northern Asia and a lot of northern Europe and North America was covered in 2-mile thick sheets of ice. These lands are completely inhospitable. There's no animals there, there's no people there, there's no usable plants there. So, ultimately, when these things start to pull back, when you see this ice sheet pulls back, that gives us a lot of the geography that we're going to be looking at in North America. That's where you see the formation of the Great Lakes up in my neck of the woods in Michigan and Indiana and Illinois. In those areas, you can see as the ice sheet pulls back, it's going to form the Great Lakes and leave those big fresh bodies of water there. The same thing can be said for Salt Lake in Utah. These are all features that happen when the ice starts receding. And it's the movement of this ice is what really starts to shift human engagement with the Americas. So, ultimately, when the water gets taken up from the ocean into the ice caps, it's going to lower down the ocean levels. When this happens, a land bridge opens up. In theory, this is what our best sort of theory for people coming to the Americas. This land bridge opens up between Siberia and Alaska, and people start walking from Northeast Asia all the way over to the Americas. And so they're going to come in right around modern-day Alaska, and then there is a passage that goes right through the middle of Canada down into the modern United States, right around what we now call Montana. And so what happens here is that the ice starts to recede and it pulls back. When this happens, this little narrow a passageway opens up in this big thick sheet of ice that's totally covering Canada and the northern United States, and that allows people to start walking through. Now, this begs a really important question. Why are these migrants moving? Why are they coming to the Americas in the first place? The answer is pretty simple. They're following big game animals. The progenitors of Native American cultures are generally hunter-gatherer societies, and they would be hunting large land animals that, as soon as the land bridges opened up and they were able to move, they would ultimately start spreading around, and then the people would follow them. So they're following things like yaks, woolly mammoths, antelopes, different types of deer, bovine creatures. And so basically, when the idea is that this land bridge opens up about 30,000 to 20,000 BCE, or what we used to call BC, before Common Era. And then over a period of thousands of years, the ice melted and the ocean levels rise back up. And so the land bridge actually comes and fills back in with water. Now, as that ice starts pulling away and starts filling the oceans back up and the warming is going on, people start following the recession, the receding ice or the recession of the ice. They follow it from Canada all the way down to the tip of South America. So that's one theory for how people came to ultimately establish societies here in the Americas. And the theory there says that by 8000 BC, that Native Americans had arrived on the east coast of North America and in South America, all the way down at the southern tip of Chile. But there are other theories floating around, and it seems to me like every year a new theory comes out about how these proto-Native Americans moved around, how these migrants got to where they were going. And the newer theory says that people came by boats before the land bridge ever formed. So this would have been before 30,000 BC. They're saying that people in the same region of Northeast Asia, that Bering region of Siberia, they were getting on boats and sailing to the west coast of the Americas. They think that they sailed to the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska and then followed down the sort of border of Canada, the coastline, down to California, and then they kept moving south all the way to South America, down to the southern tip. And so this theory is gaining steam quite a bit, and the reason for that is because we start to dig out artifacts in a place like Washington State, up in the Pacific Northwest, on the Pacific coast, and we find that artifacts are the exact same age as what they're also seeing down in South America, down in places like Chile. And so they pull out these two artifacts and they look and they go, these look exactly the same, and that would tell a historian or an anthropologist or an archaeologist that this is probably made by a similar group of people, a group that has some communication with each other or some sort of genetic link to another group, that they're somehow connected. And so when we see these artifacts popping up in two totally different places at the same time, it's lending credence to the idea that that's one cohesive group moving down the coastline by boat. So those are the two theories for how people came to the Americas. Once they were here, we call these groups Proto-Indians, Proto-Native Americans, or Paleo-Indians. And for the most part, these groups are hunter-gatherers. They use stone-tipped spears. They hunted all different types of game animals: mammoths, mastodons, sloths, bison, deer, antelope, beavers, you name it, they would have been hunting it. And so they would also be gathering fruits and nuts. There really is no settled agriculture for a long time amongst these Paleo Indians. Many of the groups are highly nomadic. They would tend to wander around in small bands that sometimes they could be as small as 15, 20, 35 people, something in that range. And this is something that is giving them some sort of social stability. The remaining in small groups allows them to move more quickly and more efficiently. Now, all of a sudden, what we tend to see is that there becomes this really big shift in Native American society. So what we're tending to see is that big game starts to become extinct north of Mexico by about 9000 BC. Big game were already becoming extinct by 10,000 BC in Europe. But really what we're seeing is there was some sort of climactic shift that impacted the game animals, and this was a major problem for these proto or paleo Indian groups. They now are no longer going to be able to solely rely on hunting and gathering, and so the solution to that problem is they start turning to agriculture. Now, what this means is at about 9,000 years ago, when that big game dies off, what we tend to see is that settled agriculture becomes the new way of producing a food surplus for a society. They start to grow food and cultivate land between about 8,000 and 5,000 BC. And they would be using stone tools that they used to use to butcher animals and to hunt, to plant potatoes, squash, corn, tomatoes, things that we know were endemic here to the Americas. So the end result of all of that is that these groups became less nomadic. They tended to basically start settling down and building villages. They started ultimately developing religious structures that fit their new lifestyle. Now they would ultimately pray. You look at a lot of proto Native American groups and even Native American groups, Their religion tends to be based a little bit more around the natural world, sun, wind, rain, different factors that would help fertility in the growing season. And so they start shifting their religion to meet their new social structure. And the idea here is once you start growing food, you're looking to create a food surplus. And this is very important because it allows people to specialize. This is important to every human society. It's not just the Native American groups. This is important to everybody. For example, I don't have the luxury of sitting around talking about history all day. If I've got to go physically kill the animal that I need to eat my meat, go and grow the crops and cultivate them every day. I don't have time to get a PhD in history if I have to produce my own food every single day, if I have to feed myself and my family. If I don't have a grocery store, if I don't have a butcher, if I don't have somebody else to do that for me, some farmer out in the field growing my corn, well, now I've got to do it. And therefore, I'm not going to focus on education, military, art, economy, politics, religion, all of these other aspects of society grow because human beings are settling and producing a food surplus. And this is a major shift in what's happening here in the Americas. And right along with this settled agriculture, we see a massive explosion in Native American populations. As I mentioned, specialization becomes a much bigger factor in these societies. And as part of that specialization, you start to see that work becomes more and more differentiated based on one's gender. So men would be sort of tasked with different things than women would be. Women would be responsible, obviously, for procreation and the well being of the family, but they'd also take different agricultural tasks that they would be responsible for. We tend to see this amongst Native American groups. As I mentioned, I'm an Africanist. You see this in the pre-contact period in West Africa quite a bit too, where women cultivate certain types of crops, men cultivate another. So the societies become much bigger and much more sophisticated. And that is why there's a really very, very clear correlation between the largest empires of the Americas and this location of the first settled agriculture. It's happening in the Valley of Mexico. And that tends to be where we see the biggest empires of the New World. You have the Mayans, the Incas, the Aztecs, the Toltec, the Olmec. All of these very sophisticated societies are all growing out of this process of settled agriculture and producing a food surplus so that your society can specialize. So, moving on, I am going to, obviously, there's not enough time to talk about every Native American group that would potentially be ultimately involved in the foundations or that basically Europeans are going to be encountering when they get here. And so what happens is we got to kind of just say Native Americans are too diverse to describe. I can't, anybody who sits there and says Native Americans did this or they didn't do that or they dressed like that or they worshiped like this. There is no uniformity amongst these cultures. They're way too diverse. You could go from one community of 400 people to a community of 1 million people right next door to one another. The religions are different. The economy is different. Their military prowess is different. And so you can't really just say, hey, they all do the same thing. So what we are going to do, though, is what we call case studies. We're going to zero in on a couple of different cultures. And I generally focus on environmental history in this part of the course because what really puts Native American social attitudes and European social attitudes at odds with one another is their outlook on nature. And so I don't want to paint an overly rosy view of the cultures that I'm talking about here in the Americas. This tends to happen when you go back, there's an idealization of Native American cultures. They were all peaceful. They were all very in touch with the earth. They never did anything that hurt the land. They sat around big bonfires and playing kumbaya on guitars and sang to the animals. This is the kind of stuff that it's just patently untrue. The groups that were living here in the Americas were constantly engaged in warfare. They were constantly engaged in slavery and human sacrifice when we look at some of these larger empires down in Latin America, when you look at like the Aztec, the Incans, and the Mayans. So it's not this very peaceful kumbaya-like society, but Native Americans tend to have a far different view of the environment and their role within the larger natural world than Europeans who would be going out into the Atlantic are going to bring with them. And so I highlight a few different groups here when we talk about Native Americans. And we're going to start with the biggest and the most visible that are going to be met on the eve of expansion for Europe into the Americas, and that's the Aztec. So most of you, I'm sure, are probably familiar with the overall trajectory of that story. The conquistadors show up, and they are going to ride in and collapse the massive Aztec empire, and Montezuma is going to have to give his empire over to Cortez. So, the narrative history is there, and what we do want to look at, though, what I would like to kind of take when it comes to the collapse of the Aztec empire, it has everything to do with their social structure. When we look at the Aztecs, they are really a pretty unique group. They're they start as a loosely affiliated group of Nawa speakers in this region of Lake, right around Lake Texcoco, and today what would be like Mexico City. And so the groups are going to start settling there and conglomerating under this label of the Aztec Federation. What they do is they create this loose politico-religious hegemony over the smaller surrounding groups. The Aztec Empire, or the Aztec Confederacy, as it's often called, is a collection of smaller satellite states. This is what they call tributary states. What the Aztecs were able to do is go out and conquer smaller communities and roll them into their growing empire. Very simply put, this is how the Aztecs did business if you were one of their neighbors. They came in and they said, look, I've got a stronger military, I've got more people, I can crush you and take what's yours and make it mine if you don't want to work with me. And so basically they could come into neighboring communities and threaten them with total annihilation. Or they give them the option of paying a tribute. Every month you're going to give me 10 bushels full of corn. That's what's going to happen. When I come back around, I want a certain amount of gold given to me. And so this is how they start expanding their power. They go and they threaten these smaller neighbors and say, hey, you either get beat by us or you join us. And most of these smaller neighbors, without much of a choice, are going to have a chance. And so they tend to join up with the Aztec Confederacy. And so the Aztecs are able to build this really amazing capital city of Tenochtitlan. When we look at this, it's established right around 1325 Common Era, what they used to call AD. And this city, by the 1400s, on the eve of European expansion, is larger than any city you would find in Europe. It's bigger than Paris. It's bigger than London. Tenochtitlan boasts about a population of over 1 million people, whereas Paris and London are somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 at this point in time. So what this tells us is that the Aztecs have an incredibly sophisticated society, and that is because they do not worry about food production. There is a food surplus. The specialization, they have warriors, priests, political leaders, they have masons, they have woodworkers, they have weapons makers, they have stonesmiths. They have all these different sorts of jobs in their society that tells us that they're not sitting there going, gosh, I really wonder where my next meal is going to come from. And so one of the ways that they are able, and what I really want to zero in on with the Aztec here, is not so much the history that a lot of us have heard about, the collapse of the empire and this and that. What I want to point out is their ability to work with their environment. They build their capital city of Tenochtitlan right on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. So obviously we're talking about a very watery environment. The Aztec are able to channel that water for two different purposes. First, they're going to start building canals in their cities so that you can move more quickly from point A to point B. It speeds up transportation in their city. And number two, they are going to be able to channel the waters of the lake to bring them in and use the water as irrigation for their fields. When you're talking about a society that relies on settled agriculture, that's an important development, is channeling the water in for irrigation. So the Aztecs are able to grow this massive population in this huge city because they are so successful at harvesting what's available to them. They're able to channel the waters of this lake and use it for their own ends. And so in addition to being able to really irrigate their fields and get proper water running to their crops, they're also able to load their crops up into boats and then ship them right into the central markets of the city using these canals and waterways. And so they are really, really finely tuned to their environment. And that's a major, major factor in the Aztec society. So ultimately, what we're going to see here is that the Aztecs will collapse when they encounter the Spanish conquistadors. And the old story that I heard in school was, well, the conquistadors rode in on horses with guns and steel swords, and the Aztecs thought they were gods, and the Aztecs just gave up, and that was the end of it. That's not really what's going on here. The way that the Spanish are able to use a small number of Spaniards to collapse the Aztec Empire is they play upon resentments that already exist in the local area. You can't go in with a flintlock rifle, which is the type of technology that Spanish would have had at that point in time. You can't go in with a flintlock rifle, which, if you're really good, light the wick, and it goes, in 45 seconds, I can get a shot off if I'm good with this weapon. When you've got 5,000 Aztec warriors with bolos, spears, obsidian tipped spears, and arrows, you don't got 45 seconds to stand there with 49 other guys and think you're going to win this war. And that's not how it happened. What the Spaniards did is they played divide and conquer politics. And they went around to the smaller neighbors of the Aztecs, the neighbors who were resentful of Aztec leadership being forced upon them. And they got those groups to rebel with them. They got those groups to start attacking the Aztec Empire, and the Spaniards worked in tandem with those Native Americans to collapse it. So that's one of our examples. Now, when we look at North America, the area that we're most concerned with in a U.S. history class, the population before 1492 is fewer than 4 million people. They lived in small, widely scattered, impermanent settlements for the most part, and there's incredible diversity here. In North America, there's a lot of small groups. They all have their own languages. They all have their own social hierarchies. Some follow a patrilineal organization of societies. Others are matrilineal. And that brings me to my next case study, another group that we're going to look at living in sort of in this really close relationship with their environment, and that is the Pueblo builders of the American Southwest. So this group obviously you couldn't walk into one of their communities prior to the 1500s and say, "Hey, you a Pueblo?" Yeah, sure, I'm a Pueblo. That's not what they're called. This is a bunch of different groups all in the same region. Sometimes they're the big subgroups of the Pueblo builders would be the Hopi, the Zuni, the Tawa, groups like that. They would build these really elaborate adobe stone villages and towns in the American Southwest, which is an incredibly arid and dry region. And again, we can put this in juxtaposition with the Aztecs. The Aztecs have an abundance of water, so they use it to create a stable society. The Pueblo builders have no water, and they're going to have to find a way to live in that environment as well. And so that is really the way that the Pueblo builders are going to do this is by building their towns right into the side of cliffs, and their construction style helps them live in this dry, hot environment. They build into the side of cliffs because the deeper down you go into the side of the cliff, the cooler it is. You're getting out of the sun, you're going a little bit deeper down. That's going to cool you off. They also put windows entirely in the tops of their buildings. When you see a window in Pueblo architecture, it's not to look out of and see a big, beautiful vista or something. This is to basically allow the stone keeps cool on the floor, and as we all know, hot air rises. And when it gets to the top, it escapes out of the windows that are all situated at the top of Pueblo construction. Now, with all the different techniques they had for living in this environment, the truth is you can't grow a massive society in the middle of a desert. It's just not possible. You don't want to try to get a massive society because there are not enough resources there to sustain you. And so they practice a very interesting form of matrilineage amongst many of these Pueblo groups. What that means to be matrilineal is to follow your descendancy through your mother's line. And so we in Western society and in Western culture tend to be vastly patrilineal. There's really very little matrilineal influence in most Western societies. But in the Pueblo builders, they practiced matrilineage, and they also had some unique marriage practices. So polygamy refers to when one spouse takes multiple spouses. And so the most common form of polygamy that we're used to seeing is one husband taking many wives. This is done most of the time in very, very resource abundant areas. Because let's look at it this way: if I have 9 wives, I can get them all pregnant tonight and have 9 kids in 9 months, barring twins or triplets or anything. I can, and so I can go and impregnate 9 women all in the same night, in the same day. And what that means is that I'll have 9 kids in 9 months, and we can start taking advantage of these abundant resources. The Pueblos were not really, they didn't build these massive settlements and these massive societies because the land just would not really allow for it. So instead, they practice matrilineage and they seek that ancestry through their mother's side, and what they do is their wives take many husbands in a lot of these Pueblo cultures. This helps cut down on the demand for resources. So if I have 9 wives, I can have 9 kids in 9 months. If my wife has 9 husbands, she's going to have probably 1 kid in 9 months. She's only going to get pregnant by one of us. And so it cuts down on your population growth. And so these social patterns that we're seeing that have been developed, when Westerners came in, they said, wow, that's really weird. That's not how we do it. That looks strange. There is a reason for the way that these groups are organizing. And they're organizing socially in these ways because they're ultimately trying to live in tandem with their environmental constraints. So that's what the Playboy Builders were all about. We also, in our lecture, talk a little bit about the Native American group known as the Mississippian or the Mound Builders culture. This group's kind of interesting because they had died out before Europeans even showed up. And as their name suggests, they were living all along the banks of the Mississippi River. Usually, our best estimate is that the group started to break down and become different subgroups in that region of America sometime around 11,000 to, 1100 to 1200, probably in the Common Era. So we're talking about 1100 AD is when this group starts to disband or break down. Now, this group is interesting because it throws into sort of this conflict into our view of Native Americans. For most of the interest in Native Americans historically, people are writing about these groups that are very small, still semi-nomadic, and really what we're looking at here is that these groups really don't build big cities, big empires. North American Native Americans are small. And they're really egalitarian. They basically practice gerontocracies, which mean they respect the old in terms of political leadership. They have councils that make decisions rather than kings. Things like this. They're very, very diffuse in their structure of power. Now, the Mississippian culture shows us the exact opposite of that. We didn't even know we were living right on top of the evidence of these cultures. Their capital city, a city named Cahokia, is located in southern Illinois. It's the closest major city to it. Is if you cross down into Missouri, you're going to be in St. Louis. And so it's down in these farmlands in southern Illinois. And right there, there's these big mounds, and we have been living on top of them, planting farms on top of them for years. We find out that this is the evidence of the Mississippian culture. These are burial mounds, ceremonial mounds. The group lived along the banks of the Mississippi River, setting up these large urban centers, cities. And what we see within these burial mounds, it's interesting. We turn to archaeology here to tell us something about these groups. And what we're seeing is in these burial mounds, you've got one guy is buried with shark's teeth and seashells and elaborate cloths that weren't available to him in his region of the country, animal skins that just simply weren't around him. And so what that's telling us is these are exotic goods. They were probably acquired through distance trade with either the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere in that coastal region. And he's brought these things back because he's a wealthy person. And so what we're looking at is with this situation of digging out these burial mounds, I see this guy with lots of stuff. He's important. He's wealthy. There's your upper class. Then we dig out these other burial mounds. There's a people in the middle with a few trinkets, kind of not a whole lot of stuff, but some material culture around them. And we estimate there, sort of guess that that's going to be your middle class. And then we go down the line and we look even lower and we see people basically wrapped in a sheet thrown in a hole. There's your lower class. we're seeing very, very similar social stratification to Western society within the Mississippian culture. They're very good distance traders. They were well connected to different parts of the Americas. But that group, really, what's interesting about them and what I want you to take away from that section of the lecture is that really that group is practicing this very, very, very intricate, stratified sort of higher, middle, and lower class social stratification. So, the last group of Native Americans I'm going to talk about today is the Eastern Woodlands people. This is kind of the Native American that pops into mind when you are thinking of basically the decentralized teepees, wigwams, longhouses, smaller communities. This is the Eastern Woodlands people. It's a big catch-all term that describes all the Native Americans living in decentralized, more egalitarian societies along the eastern seaboard from Canada down to Georgia and Florida. And so most of these groups fall into the language categories of Algonquin or Iroquois speakers. These are sort of, like I said, these are the classic Hollywood Native Americans, the ones who they travel seasonally between one area and another, and that's because of the environment they live in too. They're semi-nomadic because I can tell you firsthand, having grown up in Metro Detroit, you don't want to be in Michigan in the middle of January without heat. I promise you that. And so these groups are going to move south and go down to areas like Kentucky or Tennessee where it stays a little bit warmer. Game animals are moving down there. So these groups are hunter-gatherers. They practice some settled agriculture, but it's not so much true agriculture as much as it is sort of just selective crop cultivation. And these groups are almost constantly involved in this very small scale sort of warfare, skirmishes. A lot of times, warfare, when you're talking about a society that's only got 40 to 80 people in it, you can't afford to have major losses on the battlefield. So it seems kind of funny to us today, and it seems a bit odd. A lot of times in war, the goal was not to kill your enemy. You even had different groups of these Native Americans up in this region. Their style of warfare was basically to run up and see if they could slap the opponent in the face and run back before they got hit. And so the idea here is that even the warfare is set up in a way that's sustainable with their lifestyles. They're 40 to 80 people. No, I can't line up across the battlefield and march at you and lose 80% of my population in a war. And so since it doesn't mean that they're devoid of conflict, that they don't have territorial or resource-based conflicts, they absolutely do. It's just they're not these wide-scale, massive military conflicts. It's really small-scale skirmishes. But these groups are going to be the ones, the Native Americans in the Eastern Seaboard, for reasons that you can probably imagine, are going to be the group that we're encountering the most in our class. Here in an American history class, these are the groups that are interacting with the early English-speaking settlers in that region of the United States. So that wraps up my talk about indigenous America, Paleo-Indians, and what's happening on the American side of the Atlantic up to 1590. Now, this is we're got to move on to the next subject, which is there's two other sides that contribute to what's going on in the Americas. Obviously, Europe is one of those sides. And so we need to look at European settlement here in the Americas and really larger. It's not just the Americas. They're settling all over the globe at this point in time. And so the Europeans are being driven to expand and migrate and leave Europe by a couple of different factors. This doesn't happen arbitrarily. We have 1492 is the date most of you are familiar with. You know, Columbus sails the ocean blue, and he accidentally discovers the Americas. And of course, what was he trying to discover? He was trying to discover India. This tells us a bigger story about what's going on in Europe at this point in time, before they expand outward into the Atlantic and become maritime cultures. Europe had for a very long time relied on trade networks that ran all the way to East Asia. China and India are two major markets that you need to have access to if you want to have a successful consumer economy in Europe. And so this had been going okay because by way of the Mediterranean, Europe would get Asian goods, Indian goods. because they're being carried over land routes. But something had happened in recent history that really colors the way that Europe is going to be forced to go out to the Atlantic, and that is the growth of Islamic empires in the Old World. It is not circumstantial that in the 1400s Europeans start actively sailing out into the ocean, and it's not circumstantial that or sort of random that Columbus is trying to find a sea route to India. India is where Europe needed to go, and it was what the Islamic or Muslim dynasties of the Old World had cut them off from. You had the growth of the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe. By 1529, the Ottomans are pushing on Vienna in Austria. They're into Central Europe. So they've blocked the Balkans. They've blocked the Mediterranean coast. They've taken control as far as North Africa. When you move from there, you have the Berber kingdoms, what the Europeans call Moors. They've actually spread all the way across northern Africa and up into Spain and Portugal, into the Iberian Peninsula. That's an issue we'll be talking about a little bit when we get into the roots of colonial societies in America next week. But the Spaniards have been overrun by Islamic dynasties. There's no path through Africa. There's no path through the Mediterranean. There's no path out of East Europe. So how do you get to India? And the answer is we've got to sail there. Now, a lot of the European navigators at this point in time said you can't sail west and hit India. One, it's way too far. You'll never make it. Everybody on board will die. Two, we're pretty sure there's a big landmass out there. We don't know what it is or what's on it, but it's not India. There's something in between us and India. So, the idea that he could sail to India, that Columbus had this idea, was not well received in his own time because actually some people were better informed. They were saying, look, you can't make it to India, it's too far. And you've got to go, if you want to get to India, you've got to go around Africa. That's the truth. And that's something that Columbus would have to discover firsthand. But he sails west and ends up hitting the Caribbean, and then eventually on return trips, I think he made his way up into Florida and the mainland United States. But this is all coming at a time of mounting territorial pressure. Europe's population is rebounding, so the demand for products and goods is much higher. They're coming back from the bubonic plague or the Black Death. So it's right around this time, there is more demand for resources, and Europe has to look to the outside world to get them. Well, they've just been cut off from the biggest resource markets in the world, in Asia. So they have to find another way to get there. Most people are going to go south around Africa, and they start forming trade relationships along the west and southern African coasts. These trade relationships are eventually, as you can imagine, going to morph into the Atlantic slave trade, something that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But ultimately, you see Europe is coming out because they have to, because of the growth of these Islamic kingdoms. When they do so, they're coming with a new idea, a new sort of economic mode of operation. It's this idea of capitalism. Capitalism is a key sort of organizational factor that we're going to be using in this class this semester. And when we look at capitalism, what this really means on its bottom line is the prices and the supply should be governed by the free market. In other words, people should be willing to go and pay whatever they want or whatever they're willing to pay for a product. You should be able to sell it from wherever you want. Capitalism says there should be no regulation or interference within the free market. When Europeans come out of Europe with this idea, they come out and thinking, there's a reason that they have to be thinking in this way. They're about to get on a boat, which may or may not make it to India over the course of a month, 2 months. They're going to die of dysentery, scurvy, starvation, dehydration, shipwreck. People fall off the boats and get eaten by sharks. It's not good. This is a terrible lifestyle to be a long-distance trader in European culture. Mortality rates in the Atlantic world in the 1500s are ridiculously high. And it's not just African slaves who are dying in great numbers in the Atlantic. Europeans are dying in great numbers in the Atlantic. Mortality in their New World settlements are high. Mortality rates on the boat is high. This is a miserable expedition you're signing up for when you say, I'm going to get on a boat and sail to India and try and buy some spice. All this for a little bit of black pepper to put on your steak. Why? Why is somebody going to put their life on the line to do this? Because somebody back in Europe is willing to pay a lot of money for that black pepper. And that is free market capitalism. That's laissez-faire capitalism. If I'm willing to pay $1 million for a dirty old pair of shoes, then those shoes are worth $1 million because that's what it's worth on the open market. So Europe comes out with this idea, and they start developing ideas like stock markets, banks, investing in futures. If I'm going to pay for a boat to go halfway around the world and pick up some black pepper in great quantities that I want to sell back in Germany or France, I'm going to want insurance because when that boat wrecks, I need to get my money back. I need a bank to back me up to give me a loan so I can buy a boat and pay the men up front to go get the pepper. All these modern conceptions of economy are coming from this time period when Europe's being forced to go outside of its own borders to find the resources it wants. And this new idea emerges that capitalism is the way. Laissez-faire capitalism is this attitude that kind of comes out there. Now, another thing that comes along with this is it's worth whatever it's worth, and if someone's going to pay me a lot of money, then I'll risk some people's lives to get this done. Um, Alongside that attitude comes a different attitude towards nature and a relationship with nature. If my bottom line is money, 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 and I've got to get it, and that's the only way I can compete in this free market, then a forest in my way is an obstacle that I can't afford to have in my way. I'm not going to work with the forest. I'm not going to slowly cut a nice path through the undergrowth. I'm going to burn the entire thing to the ground and get it out of my way. That's capitalism. That's the idea that Europeans come with when they come to the Americas. Progress is civilization. Progress is cutting nature out of the way. It's bypassing nature when it's in the way. If there's a river in your way, you build a bridge over it. If there's a tree in your way, you cut the tree down. If there's a bunch of crops growing in your field that you don't like, but the native local animals eat it, and the deer eat it, and the other game animals in the region eat it, I don't care. Let them find some other food. I'm going to cut this whole thing to the ground and plant what I want to plant here. Slash and burn agriculture. And this is the way Europe goes out into the Atlantic world. They say, I don't got time to play around. I've got to make money. That's my bottom line. It's all in this attitude of hyper competition. And that's because all of Europe is in hyper competition. If I don't get my piece of the pie, then another European nation is going to. If I'm England and I don't get as much rubber as I can possibly get from India, I'm kind of jumping to the 1800s. Let's call it timber. If I can't get as much timber as I can possibly get from India, if I don't buy the timber, France is going to come in and buy it. If I don't come into New England and buy up all the hemp that's being produced on the hemp plantations in New England, then Spain is going to come along and get it. All of this is all the resources. There's this understanding in the European mind. The world's resources are finite. They're limited. There's only so much to go around. If I don't get it, somebody else is going to, and then they're going to use it to crush me and take what I've got. And so that's the hyper competitive attitude that Europe comes out with into the Atlantic world. And as you can imagine, this is really going to put them kind of at loggerheads or at odds with the Native American groups who are finding ways to work with and within the environment. So the Native American groups are going to be exposed to these new migrants. The Spanish are coming, the French are coming, the English are coming, Dutch, Russian, Danish. They're all here, the Germans. And when they're coming, they're bringing something nefarious with them. And Europeans don't even realize they're doing it. They're carrying immunities to livestock. They're carrying immunities to the animals that they grew up around in Europe. And they they have immunities to things like smallpox, foot and mouth disease, all of these cattle and bovine-borne diseases. Native Americans don't have those immunities because they don't have those types of domesticated animals. And so when Europeans start arriving, disease ravages the Native American communities. There's this idea, when I was in school, there was this idea that, well, how come Europe was able to just come in and take over the Americas? And the answer to it was usually they had guns, they had horses, they had armor, they had steel. None of those are satisfactory in terms of their explanation. What you're seeing is that in some areas, 90% of the population died within a generation of being exposed to these diseases. The way that Europeans, they don't come in with technological superiority, they come in with immunological superiority. They have been exposed to a wider range of microbes and bacteria that they have built an immunity towards that Native Americans simply didn't have because of isolation. They've been broken away from the old world populations for 30,000 years. They don't have these immunities anymore. So we're seeing roughly 40 to 60 million Native Americans die at this point in time. The ballpark estimate for the total population of Native Americans, the highest estimate I've ever seen, is across all of the Americas, you have about 120 million Native Americans. We're seeing at least half of them are dying. And if that number is too high, if the number is lower, if we say that there's really, and some historians have estimated, there's really only about 45 million Native Americans living here, and 40 million of them are dying off, or 30 million are dying off, we've got a serious, serious problem in these indigenous communities of the New World. And so this is what's going on. Europeans aren't coming over with advanced weaponry. Yeah, a gun would be nice, but the guns they're using back then, they're blunderbusses, they're flintlock rifles, they're highly inefficient, they're highly inaccurate, and they're very, very slow. You'd be much better off throwing a spear at someone. I could probably beat somebody with a handful of rocks before they got me with a blunderbuss or a flintlock rifle, because I can just stand there and keep pelting them with it one after another, and I'm not waiting. Bam, there we go. All right, now I got to load it in. It's not European technological superiority that wins them the day in the Americas. It's the fact that they unknowingly and unwittingly carry these diseases with them, to which Native Americans have no response. And so that's what we're seeing happening here. We'll pick up with that European colonial competitive nature in our next lecture. The last side of the Atlantic that I want to touch on briefly, and it's one that I don't think gets a whole lot of coverage in your textbook or in a lot of American history classes in general, and that is the African side of the Atlantic exchange. And I've given you a lot to sort of work through in that part of the lecture. But there's obviously, the connection between the Americas and Africa is going to be by way of the Atlantic slave trade. Most of you are probably innately familiar with that episode of America's history, or the Americas, plural, history. So when we look at the overall scope and what's going on here with West Africa, we got to give them some fair treatment as well. What we're seeing in terms of historical coverage, they are contributing to the populations of the New Worlds in more ways than just labor. If you're going to say, one thing that really is my pet peeve as an Africanist who has to teach American history, I hate it when people go, Africans brought dance and music and food. Okay, what are you talking about? What Africans? Because Africa is not even a concept in Africa. The idea that they see some sort of continental affiliation by way of race is a complete misnomer. What we have going on here, Africa as a label is a European label, and it's the outside world refers to Africa as Africa. Africa is, I think, easily, arguably, the most diverse continent on the planet. You have, at this point in time, a country like Nigeria, with which I'm familiar. Nigeria today has 512 different languages and ethnic groups. Back then, they probably were broken down even more. The group that I study, the Igbo speakers, they broke down community by community. My group is over here, your group's over there. There's no connection or affiliation between us. We're not all Igbo. We don't identify that way. And so I always found it a very stupid statement to say Africans brought, because there was no what Africans. Which ones are we talking about? And so what I want you to become familiar with is African cultural, economic, and linguistic transfers in the early Atlantic exchange, and to be able to identify the specific location in Africa from where these things came. Because there is no such thing as African back then. There was no Africans. They were African people because that's the label Europeans gave to them. But if you ask them, they're Yoruba, they're Igbo, they're Mende, they're Jollof, they're Akan, they're Asante, they're Bakongo, they're Kiswahili, they're San, they're Luo, they're Kikuyu. I could go on and sit here for days listing different ethnic groups in Africa. But there is something going on in the early Atlantic world. European slave ships are not going to Africa and then sailing up and down the entirety of the African coast, stopping at multiple ports, and then going to the Americas and just throwing everybody around widely into different colonies. There is a distinct pattern of ethnic clustering that allows us to trace African cultural retentions from Africa across the Atlantic to the Americas. Um, and so this is called ethnic clustering. A European boat is going to leave Europe and it's going to go to one spot in Africa. Chances are that coastal trading port in Africa is going to have a majority of one type of ethnic group is going to be sold in that market as slaves. I'll take just the example I know to give you some clarity. In the Niger Delta, you were going to go buy Igbo speaking slaves in the Niger Delta communities. So if my boat sails from England down to the Niger Delta, a community like Bani or Apobo, I sail in and I buy 50 slaves to put in my slave ship. 48 of them are probably Igbo people. And so they have the similar mutually intelligible language, mutually intelligible religious culture, social structure, norms. All these things are shared amongst these people. And then my boat doesn't go, well, I'm going to go to Atlanta, and then I'm going to go to Houston, then I'll go to Jamaica, then I'll go. No, it's coming to one spot in America. And so what we're seeing is we can trace from Africa to America what's happening. There's three different cultural retentions I'm going to zero in on. I know I've got to wrap this thing up soon, but I want to really look at these broad cultural zones. You have the Upper Guinea Coast, which it's basically modern day Senegambia, all the way down to countries like Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast. So that region is called the Upper Guinea Coast. The largest group of slaves, and this is what you need to know about on an exam, the largest numbers of slaves to come out of there are Southern Mende people. The Southern Mende people are rice agriculturalists. And very early on in the Atlantic slave trade, in the late 1600s, they were brought to the coastal lowlands of South Carolina and Georgia, here in the United States. And the Europeans are standing there looking at these swampy marshes going, what are we going to do with this territory? And it is not the European landowners, it is the African slaves that look and go, that's perfect for rice agriculture. And it's the African knowledge of rice agriculture is shipped from West Africa by way of the slaves. We're not just talking about they were brought here to work in the rice fields. Yeah, they were. But they also brought the technology for winnowing the rice. They made the sweetgrass baskets. Europeans had no idea. They didn't even know you could grow rice in a region like that. Europeans weren't rice agriculturalists. It's the Southern Mende people from a region around Liberia and right next to it, Sierra Leone, that area. They're moving directly to South Carolina and Georgia. Today, there is a group of people called the Gullah people in this region, South Carolina and Georgia. They are recognized as maintaining the most Africanisms in their speech, in their culture, than any other group in North America. So what we're seeing there is that they brought so many Southern Mende people all to one area that Mende culture transformed into Gullah culture, and we still have cultural retentions from the Mende people. But in addition to that, they also brought the knowledge, the technology, the know-how to establish a rice industry that still exists in that region of the country until today. So no, I'm not talking about some Africans sometime brought gumbo. Yes, that's, and most likely that's a transfer from Angola or the West Central African region. We'll get to that when we move down the broad cultural zones. But I'm asking you all to zero in, not say African, which group of Africans, where in the Americas are they ending up? The next group I want you to be familiar with, we're going to move down to what they call the Lower Guinea Coast. This is an area that spreads from modern day Ghana all the way over to the northern Cameroon and southern Nigeria. So at one point in Atlantic history, this was known as the Slave Coast. That should tell you something about what they're contributing to the Atlantic World Trade Networks. Largely, it's slaves. But within this region, there's three different groups of people I want you to be familiar with. And that is because they're going to be bringing a very, very notable and visible religious transfer from Africa to the New World. And these are the Fon, Ewe, and Yoruba people. These three groups, they spread from eastern Ghana all the way to western Nigeria. So they spread through Benin, Togo, into Nigeria. This group all had a similar religious structure. They had a creator deity that they believed in, one big God who created everything. And then they had a system, but you couldn't talk to that God. You could never pray to that big creator deity. They had to pray to what were known as lesser deities, what they called orishas. And they prayed to these lesser deities and they say, I want good health for my family. I need better luck in the growing season. I need this, I need that, I need the other thing. All these orishas served smaller functions. So when people started getting taken away from the slave coast and brought to different areas, mostly in the Caribbean, but also to a lesser degree here in the colony of New Orleans and Louisiana, this group came over, and whenever they settled in these uh, European colonies that followed Catholicism, when they were exposed to Catholicism, not to Protestant Christianity, but to Catholicism, they built syncretic religions. They saw the saints of Catholicism as being pretty much the same as their orishas, and they blended the two together. And so, from the Fon, Ewe, and Yoruba people of the Lower Guinea coast, from that region between Ghana and western Nigeria, they are the ones responsible for bringing all of the syncretic religious traditions. They're the ones responsible for bringing Haitian voodoo, Louisiana voodoo, Vodun. The religion itself back in West Africa is called Vodun. And so what happens is wherever they go into a Catholic colony, like the French-owned Louisiana, they're going to blend their religions together and create new ones called Voodoo, Candomblé, Santeria. These are the different types of religions that they're forming. That's a very specific group of African people. It's not just Africans general who bring these religious traditions. That's coming from a specific region of West Africa to specific areas, Catholic colonies in the New World. The last group that I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to talk about them rather generally, and then I'm going to wrap up with a few key points about the Atlantic slave trade. The largest number of people moved in the entire Atlantic slave trade were West Central Africans. These were Bakongo and Kikongo, Mbundu, Amambundu, different types of linguistic groups, but mostly they're kind of all mutually intelligible languages. They were forming small vassal states when Europe starts encountering them in about 1480 off the West African coast, West Central Africa. We're talking about a region that today would be called the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola. So that region there, they're small expansionist kingdoms that are growing and building outwards, and they're conquering neighbors, and they're sending people off into the slave markets when they do conquer them. So when the Portuguese show up there in 1480, slaves are widely available in that market. This area of Africa would become badly, badly devastated and depopulated. We see that their connection there is that the Portuguese get an early foothold on the coast in West Central Africa, and they ship people directly on a south-south access across to Brazil, their colony in Brazil. For those of you who don't know, Brazil is the largest importer of slaves by far out of any nation or colony in the New World throughout the duration of the Atlantic slave trade. And so what you need to know about West Central Africa, those groups, is that they are the ones coming in the greatest numbers. That is the largest number of people taken out of Africa over the whole 400 years of the slave trade. And so that's what's relevant to know about that group. So that they are the ones who are largely contributing to a lot of the Louisiana culture that we attribute to Africa. Things like gumbo, the different styles of dance and music, in particular that sort of call and response song. That is something that's brought over mostly with people who are Angolans and what today would be Congolese. So West Central Africans are bringing a lot of what we recognize in American culture today as being African derived. That's the region of Africa that's coming from. And so the connection, again, I got to come back and wrap this thing up, is obviously those are the broad cultural zones that we're looking at. Those are the sorts of economic and linguistic and cultural transfers we're seeing going on during the Atlantic world's exchange. But there's a few other key points that you need to know about the Atlantic slave trade, and they're very clearly laid out in this week's PowerPoint lecture, but I do want to touch on them briefly. First and foremost, the Atlantic slave trade is not, contrary to popular belief, is not a major part of American history. America is rather marginal in the overall scope of the Atlantic slave trade. The slave trade itself is coming to an end right around it's starting to die down right around the time America becomes independent anyway. The colonial engagement with the Atlantic slave trade was definitely existent, but marginal when compared to Brazil or the West Indies. Overall, when we look at the total scope and volume of the Atlantic slave trade, we're talking about the forced migration of about 12 to 13 million. Uh, Actually, I should widen that out. The best estimate is about 12 to 14 million Africans are being forced to migrate during the Atlantic slave trade. With that, you have a mortality rate of about 15%. That is worked out over the Middle Passage when people are forced into the overcrowded into the holds of the ships. And really, what's kind of sick and disturbing about that number, 15% is calculated. Europeans said profit maximization, one of those key things that are going out into the Atlantic world with, they use that for the Atlantic slave trade, and they say, I make the most money when 15%, when I overcrowd the slaves into the slave ships so badly that 15% of them die of overcrowding. That's where my profit maximization point hits. And so that you can see kind of how calculated and callous the Atlantic slave trade really was with that example. But it's going to go on. The first shipment of slaves comes out of West Central Africa up to Portugal. They weren't technically slaves so much as they were gifts for the King of Portugal. But they're moving up in 1460 as the first slaves taken out of Africa. And then we're going to see about, like I said, 12 to 14 million people traded between 1460 and about 1860 when the last Spanish-speaking territories of the New World are going to give up their slave systems. So, by the end of all this, in the overall accounting, we cut the Atlantic slave trade down into two systems. The first system is between 1460 and 1700. The reason we break it down this way is because there's a difference in who is doing the slave trading, who's being taken out of Africa, and where are they ending up in the New World. So to answer those three questions, during the first phase between, or the first system as we call it, between 1416 and 1700, we're looking at most of the slaves at that time are being moved by the Spanish or the Portuguese. The Spanish actually, for a long period of time, don't allow their people to engage in buying slaves and shipping them. So they actually they sub out, or they kind of subcontract that deal out to the Portuguese. So the Portuguese are moving the vast majority of slaves during the first system, even for the Spanish Empire. So those slaves were being brought mostly to South America. They're ending up, the vast majority are ending up in Brazil, where there's about 5.5 million slaves imported into Brazil over the course of the Atlantic slave trade. So that's who's doing the moving, the Spanish and the Portuguese. Where are they being taken from? West Central Africa. And where are they ending up? Mostly South America and by large measure in Brazil. Then we have the second system of the slave trade. Who's involved in moving slaves becomes a lot more diverse. Now it's the Spanish and the Portuguese are still doing their thing. It's still going strong. But now the British, the Dutch, the French have all jumped on board as well. They're all engaging in the slave trade rather heavily during this period. Because these new powers are moving in and they're not located in South America, they're located in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, in North America. You start to see the slaves during the second system between 1700 and 1860 are much more heavily moved into the West Indies. About 4.5 million slaves are going to move in there. And then into North America, you have 500,000 come into the United States, 350,000 into Mexico. And so that's the sort of breakdown of who's where people are being moved into. And they're mostly being taken at that point from the upper and lower Guinea coast. The French were moving people from the upper Guinea coast because they had better trade relationships there. They were pulling people from Senegal and Gambia and some of those kinds of territories. Whereas the British were pulling more heavily from Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, Ghana, that kind of region. And they were mostly ending up, as I said, in the U.S. and the West Indies. So The last thing I want to talk about in relation to the Atlantic slave trade is how the money breaks down. And that brings us to the triangle trade. And we call it the triangular trade because you have Europe on the top, Africa on one side, and the Americas on the other. And I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about England, Africa, and America. I want my geographic terms to be clear because all Europeans are engaged in this, not just the English. And we're not just talking about the United States, we're talking about the Americas. So, what's happening during the triangular trade is the trading ship starts up in Europe and then it sails down to Africa with manufactured goods. While it's stopped in Africa, it trades things like guns, textiles, rum, different manufactured products made from iron ore, steel sabers, cannons, stuff like that. They trade that to African middlemen states at the coast and buy slaves. Then the slaves are shipped across to the Americas, where they are sold for a profit in markets, and raw material produced by slaves in the Americas is bought and shipped back to Europe, where that raw material in Europe will again be turned into manufactured goods. So at the end of the day, the whole thing starts and repeats itself over and over and over again. No matter where that European ship is stopping in the Atlantic, it's making money. And so Americans are making money off of slavery in terms of the colonies and the settlers here. Yeah, I bought some slaves and I use them for free labor and it produces a profit on my plantation. That's how slavery it nets money in America. There are people in Africa who are communities in Africa that sell the slaves to Europeans. They're making money on it. But the people who come to dominate the Atlantic world the most are Europeans. And that's because they are making the most money. They are moving everything from point to point in this triangle, and they're profiting on all sides of the Atlantic. They profit in Africa, they profit in the Americas, and they profit in Europe as well. So we will talk again. We're going to talk a lot about slavery in this course, as you can imagine. And one key distinction that I always draw out for students is that there's a big difference between domestic American slavery, which we are going to be a very intricate look at that, and what's happening here in the United States, and then the Atlantic slave trade, in which America is at best a marginal player. They are not a major force within the Atlantic slave trade. Generally speaking, why would I pay for a boat to go all the way to Africa, buy slaves, and bring them back when I can go buy slaves in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida? I can buy slaves in Jamaica. They're already there. I can buy slaves in Barbados. They're there. And so ultimately, America, we're going to be looking at this sort of relationship between Atlantic slavery, domestic slavery, and America's place within all of that. So that wraps up this lecture for the Atlantic World to 1590. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to send me an email. Take care.